Good morning, everybody. I'm Van Rogerson, President, CEO of NC East Alliance. Thank you for joining us for the American Rescue Plan webinar. We're going to hear about the opportunities for Eastern North Carolina from some of our rural experts. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Patrick. As we get started, I just want to thank our NC East advocacy partners. At the platinum level is Bulling Company. Aaron does our website, Integrated Financial Holdings. They help us with our office in Edenton and our incubator. ECU and Vidant are two big supporters of ours. We're doing some really cool stuff together. They're on our board. Dr. Van Scott, Sharon Painter, Keith Wheeler of ECU, Dr. Waldrum is really doing some exciting things for them, so thank you. The gold sponsors, Beaufort County, Martin Johnson, Dominion Power, Brian Smith, he's on our board. Electricity's Brenda Daniels is on our board. The silver sponsors, Duke, Evolve, Martin County, Nutrien, Ray McKeithen is on our board. Edenton Chowan, Roland Vaughn is on our board. Kilpatrick Townsend, Martin Marietta, and PNC, Freeman Paler's on our board. We would love to have some of you involved with our advocacy program, so please contact Trey or I if you have interest in doing that. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Trey. You're going to kind of tell us the rules of the road for this Zoom webinar.
Awesome. Thank you, Van. So real quick, I'm going to run through the webinar tools for today. There we go. So we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar today after all the speakers. So if you do have a question, try to wait until the end and you will use the Q&A box to submit your question. If you'd like to ask a question live, you can click that raise hand icon. We will unmute you and you can ask a question live. The chat box will also be available. So if you'd like to submit your question there, you can. And we may also submit some links or resources in the chat box. So look out for those. If at any point during the webinar you need to adjust your audio settings, you can do so by clicking the audio setting tab in the bottom left and adjust your settings as needed. If you need to adjust your viewing settings today, you can do so by clicking the view options tab in the upper middle and adjust your settings as needed. You can also enter and exit full screen mode, and to do so, you will click those 4 arrows in the top right and you'll enter and exit full screen as needed. And that should be it for the rules for today. Now I'll introduce our first speaker, who is Dan Gerlach, former president of Golden Leaf and a governor's budget advisor, and now of Dan Gerlach LLC. So Dan, if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, I'm ready. So, I'm totally neutral here. Nothing to see here. Totally neutral about all the universities in the system. Just really excited about the leadership. If I can just build on what Van said, the partnership between ECU and Vidant announced earlier this week is going to make a huge difference in both the educational opportunities of people going to East Carolina, of course, but also on the Vidant side, and now to be rebranded to East Carolina Health or something like that. It's going to make a great deal of difference. And so congratulations to everybody involved in that. So I'm going to just kind of share my screen. As some of you know, I have some nerd tendencies. And so we're going to go through some slides. I believe, Trey, I'm correct in saying that these slides certainly can be available for people to ponder after this show. I mean, some people say, Dan, you must have been a tobacco auctioneer in a former life because you go pretty fast, but we have a lot of stuff to go through. And so I want to hit some highlights on it. I want to talk both about the state budget, which is in a historically great position. Never was that way when I served in the governor's office or was watching it closely. In the American Rescue Plan, which both the governor and Senate has some ideas of how to help provide some of that money in addition to the city and county monies that your counties and cities are getting directly. And some of you may be county or city managers or officials or so forth. So why is there so much money? Well, one is that state revenues are up really significantly, much more than people worried about a year ago. As a matter of fact, the change in the belief from May of 2020 to June of 2021, the change in the estimates of how much money that the General Assembly thought it would have within a fiscal year changed by billions of dollars, literally. Also, the fact is that the general fund, the state is not spending as much money, mainly because the federal government is paying a greater share of the Medicaid program than it's paid in the past, and also because some of our expenses we're able to use some federal money to fund salaries of people generally supported by the general fund. And, you know, we've had wave after wave of federal money in three pieces, basically $5 trillion into the economy through these three pieces alone. That's before we get into anything about the bipartisan infrastructure bill and everything like that. $5 billion. So even for a guy like me, that's a lot of money. Just to tell you how much money there is out there. Now, if you look at the base level budget of how much it would basically cost to operate state government, stuff supported by the general fund over a few years, and how much revenue we have coming in, you see that this year, at the year ending on June 30th, we have about $7.1 billion. That is not a typo, that is cash money, $7.1 billion more in revenue than we actually spent or were expected to spend. And in later years, it cools off a little bit, but you can see a great deal of that is also recurring, about $4.9 billion in the first year and $5.9 billion in the second year. So there's a lot to deal with. And generally, it is a challenge because there's just a lot of money to go around it. So the decisions get a little bit harder about how do you use it wisely? How do you make sure it's going to be there? Just to show you on a recurring side, historically, is the blue bars and red bars, there's no kind of ideological message here. All I'm saying is the blue bars are for budgets that are already completed. The red bars are for budgets that are not yet completed but are estimated in the forecast. This includes adjusting for a tax shift, which I won't get into. It's just to show the economy, you know, up 14% year to year from last year's flatness, if you will. And then it gets trails down to normal. So what that means is there's going to be caution. You saw the caution in the Senate budget about not spending too much money elsewhere. So what can they do with this money? Well, one, they can put money into reserves. They can give pay raises to state and local state employees and teachers. They can do spending increases in various programs, and they can cut taxes. So how did the governor and Senate do that? So the orange bar is the Senate, and the blue bar is the governor. The colors of Syracuse University, and honor my friends on here from Syracuse. I know there are a couple of you. But basically, if you look at the kind of second set of bars down, is where the governor really thought we needed to invest more money in kind of ongoing spending, right? I mean, just there's this need to go out there and invest more money into addressing the needs of public schools and on and on. Notice that the third set of bars, those kind of smaller bars, are actually tax cuts, where you would think there's a big difference, but that big difference is not felt in the immediate coming year. And basically, the Senate put more money into capital repairs and renovations and reserves. In other words, it had more money to deal with than the governor had, but it also was more cautious about the use of those monies and not to kind of obligate things in the long run. And in 22-23, you see it gets a little bit even more pronounced. And here's where you see the difference between all other spending, where the blue bar really sticks out far ahead of the orange bar is because the governor wants to spend the money. Tax cuts in the second year really start to ramp up under the Senate plan, where the governor has some tax cuts, but fairly modest ones. And so that's really the ideological differences in how are they going to balance that all out. Let's pivot to the American Rescue Plan. So the American Rescue Plan had money besides the money that we'll talk about today. Really, the bulk of the money was spent towards things that go to individuals, and to the economic impact payment, the stimulus payments that you may or may not have qualified for unemployment insurance benefits that the federal government paid for, generally the province and the state, but the federal government has paid some pandemic unemployment insurance. And then 3 new tax credits: the child tax credit, expansion of the earned income tax credit, and the dependent care credit. These are kind of not directly related to COVID, but are directly related to helping people, kind of low-income families with children, who I think in the wisdom of the Congress think they were been affected the most. So we got to give them some targeted relief. And that is a new proposal that was not in any of the other two bills, but that's new. State and local aid we're going to talk about in healthcare later on. So these are kind of the categories, but generally, you know, a lot of this money went straight into the pockets of people to spend. So what's happened? So for the American Rescue Plan to North Carolina, about $15 billion. In other words, an amount equal to over half of the state's general fund budget in a year has come on top of regular federal money to the state government through the American Rescue Plan alone, and this happened in March. Now, the General Assembly and governor, people say they can't agree on anything, fake news, because they've already agreed on how to get $6 billion of that $15 billion out the door. And then the governor and the Senate have recommendations on this that we can talk about in a second. But here's the thing, is let's remember this $15 billion is money flowing through the state treasury. There's also $2 billion going directly to North Carolina counties, $1.3 billion going directly to other municipalities, cities, towns, villages in North Carolina, including a lot in the 29 counties. So what I would do, and if I'm a local government official or local government person, I'm just being cool. Why am I being cool? Is well, because one is this $15 billion flowing through the state. Let's see what they do with that first. And then at the local level, you can figure out, okay, here are the gaps or holes where that $15 billion may not help address the needs by the pandemic. So let me pull that in. So just be cool. So how's that 14.6? It's actually 14.6 billion dropped out. So the red bar on the left, the red bar means that is not, any part of that is not law yet. The yellow bars are things where they've enacted it all in total, and basically it just needs to be executed on. So the big red bar is the Fiscal Recovery Act. It's the general kind of, here's money that the Congress wanted to get to you because they thought that all these state and local governments were going to be out of money. It was going to be, woe is me, we're going to have to do all these budget cuts unless the federal government gave them money. Well, obviously that didn't happen. So it's just money on top of a record-breaking state surplus. So that has to be dealt with. Then you look at these next two bars. These are about as kind of education spending, K-12 education spending primarily, and stuff dealing with the health and human services for various causes. That does not include anything about Medicaid that we'll talk to you about in a second. But I would say that most of that money has been allocated, but not all of it. So there's still some decisions about how to spend some of that. But a lot of your local school districts have gotten a share of this money, about a share of 3.3 billion. The yellow bars indicate there's some stuff going around. The NCORE and kind of the bigger counties have gotten out money, NCORE being the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, to help with rent assistance or utility assistance. If you know somebody in need of that, please let them know there's money to be had there, about $1 billion for the non-metropolitan areas. And they spent about, less than 50 million of it. So room's still there to go. In addition, higher education has gotten some direct money as well. Here's, the purple bar. I have no reason why I picked purple and gold here, except for the purple bar is done. That's the $6.4 billion the General Assembly's acted on. The yellow bars are kind of the categories of where they have yet to do. And so they've got a lot of block grant monies in the social services and human services realm. And also that big question mark about that 5.716, that yellow bar, the first tall yellow bar from your left. And $6.4 billion in appropriated funds, just another way to look at it, go and flip through that. Here's the breakdown of that money. So a lot of problems that you, especially in economic development, are worried about. How do we get people back to work? Concerns about the reasons why people aren't coming back to work. Frankly, the labor market in the Northeast in the 29 counties is better relatively than the labor market in most other areas, to be honest with you, with some exceptions. But I would say that basically the education and HHS money is out the door. The child care money is to help stabilize some of these child care providers, because I believe that looking at the employment patterns, that maybe that bigger unemployment insurance is causing people not to come back. But I think the idea of you basically you've shut off the engine on child care, on education and everything else. Now you're trying to crank it back up, and it's taking you a hot minute to do that. So on housing, you know, I gave you my pitch on that. So state and local aid. All right, remember I talked about, and you saw 5.4 billion, and those of you with extraordinarily good eyesight said, well, Dan, on the earlier side, you said 5.7 billion. So what is it? Well, it's 5.4 billion in kind of general aid. And then they got in a fight in Congress over, they said, we want to dedicate some of this money towards infrastructure. We just don't want to give it to you, state and local governments, and let you do whatever mischief. And so then Congress did what Congress does to get a compromise. They did both. So they gave 277 million to North Carolina on top of that money, so that gets you the 5.7. Now, both the governor and Senate have assigned that to broadband expansion. No, that's a hot topic in the Northeast. Happy to talk about that in a second. Now, the problem is you have money, but you can only have certain ways to spend it. So the trick here is to figure out how you connect to the public health emergency, the economic impact of the pandemic. Maybe you've lost some revenue. Maybe you're one of these local governments where it's just not worked out for you. Water, sewer, and broadband. And then we said, okay, so we know that's in the law, but that's kind of vague. And what we don't want to do is get caught in a position like many of us who've dealt with disaster recovery know, is where the federal government, the hurricane comes and it goes, and then you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? The federal government comes in and goes, here's just a bunch of money, just help people. And they're like, okay, so you go and help people. And then the federal government auditors come in, they go, why'd you do that with this money? We don't think that's legal, you know, and then you go through all that nonsense. So the local government, state government's like, hold on, let's see some guidance on this. And so basically the associations of local governments and state governments asked about 500 pages of questions, no lie. And so what happened is that then the Treasury Department said, okay, here's some guidance. And they just re-upped the guidance yesterday on the kind of frequently asked questions. But the restrictions are a little tighter than we thought. You need a clear tie to the pandemic. And I think anything you can do to emphasize that why you're using this American Rescue Plan money, either at the state level or the local level, to serve the communities that were the most challenged to begin with, but the kind of communities that were just kind of left out of a lot of the economic growth, a lot of the health and everything else of these challenges, you're going to be okay. Because the whole theory of the Biden administration on this is that basically those communities that were hit the hardest are the ones who suffered the most under COVID-19, and therefore the ones who need the most help. And so it ties in, whatever you think of the Biden plans, I know it's not really my business, but I would say that it's ideologically consistent with his theory and all those other bills they have rolling around up in DC. So what did the governor recommend? So here's where the governor recommended the bill. The big green bar on the left is infrastructure. That's water, sewer, broadband. Maybe a little bit for schools with lead and stuff like that, but about 2.1 billion towards broadband. Another 835 million he wanted to put into financial aid for colleges for people struggling to attend college. And really a kind of a monster effort on that. I was a little surprised it was that high. $575 million on housing. Of course, in the Northeast, like every place else, the idea of affordable housing is a great challenge. And the governor, I think, saw an opportunity to kind of invest in that for the long term. But the fourth bar is broadband subsidy. Part of the problems I think we have in our region, in addition to the fact that we don't physically have access to high quality broadband, is the fact that a lot of our people don't believe they can afford it. And so the governor would address that by kind of continuing a FCC program to help subsidize that. And then it goes on from there. One thing I will tell you is that the highly successful, since my colleague Patrick Woody's going up here, and he also, I'm a consultant for him and want to suck up the Small Business Credit Initiative, highly successful, one of the top 5 in the country by any rankings, was run by the Rural Center back in 2010. And once again, the Senate has espoused giving money from the federal government, over $120 million to the Rural Center to help administer that. So hopefully we'll get to agreement soon. That money can get going. Just some details on that. Now, what's the Senate do? So the Senate has some different ideas. But hey, look, on infrastructure, they also spend about $2.1 billion. So I believe that whatever else you can depend on, you're going to believe that there's money, and these monies are cut in different ways for infrastructure. But the second biggest part for them is business assistance. And one of these things is, if any of y'all, your organization's got a PPP loan, and you did that, and you got it forgiven by the federal government, and the federal government said you don't have to pay tax on that, and you could deduct your expenses. The state says, we're all for that, but you can't deduct the expenses. So the House would say, well, we're going to make it so that you can deduct the expenses, but that would reduce revenues by several $100 million. The Senate says, well, we're not going to do that. We're just going to give you a grant from federal money, wink, wink. That's just about exactly equal to the amount of money you pay in state taxes, so we can use the federal money for that. Then they have another business assistance program of $500 million for businesses that have lost over 20% of their revenue, but have not received any other help. So good luck finding, Dan Gerlach editorial comment, good luck finding me those businesses who have not figured out how to get some help, who've lost over 20% of their revenue. But in any case, they also give money to bonuses. They use this to give money, bonuses to state employees and so forth. That said, a lot to work out, but a lot of money in play. So this just kind of shows you this. In addition to the second year, they put money into transportation. The governor is waiting on the infrastructure bill before deciding what to do in transportation. The Senate was kind of wait and see, but put a placeholder there. Also, fun fact, the Senate didn't spend about $300 million of this money. In other words, they would allocate 5.64, there's 300 million, roughly 283 million, I think, left to go. So there's hope yet. Here's comparison proposals. But here's what I want to leave you with. If you don't remember anything else from this brilliant presentation, I want you to remember this for me. Here are the rules. You use the federal dollars that are for specific purposes first, because they have a time limit on them. So if you have federal money and you can use it for housing, or can use it for childcare, or can use it for business assistance, and those are the only things, you use that money first. Then the second thing you do is you say, okay, now you've got this kind of general money. Remember that state fiscal relief money I just talked about from the state government. So then you use that money and you figure out, okay, that could be used for healthcare or business assistance, or, on education, or a lot of different things. You have some more flexibility in that, but you use that next. And then you use the local money. That's what you do for your local government. Or in the case of the state government, you use state general fund monies after you're done with this. I would have thought the governor really had a lot of encouragement in his budget about allowing state, local governments, counties and cities, in towns and villages that had access to the ARP to leverage it. In other words, to be able to match that money with state ARP money on things of interest, and namely in fiscal infrastructure. So, but that's so, then you should use that leverage. The Senate is a little more quiet on that. So local governments, the state government, of course, we don't have to worry about revenue. Some local governments that may look at their total revenues and say our revenues are down or not up or way beyond forecast. So basically, if you're below 4.1% a year, you can use it to kind of replace lost revenue. They assume everybody will be at 4.1% growth. So that's one thing to think about. And then the funds, unlike the coronavirus relief fund monies that started flowing in March of last year, and everybody thought they had to be spent by December 31st, 2020, until December 27th, and they said, yeah, you know what, we'll give you another year. So, but on these, that actually had to be money spent, checks written out the door. These funds, these general funds to the local governments, have to be obligated by the end of 2024. So you've got a little bit of time. Do not panic about having to spend the money or lose it. 29 counties, and I'm not including the cities or villages and all this, got $275 million. Probably the number beyond that is another $150 million for the cities and villages and towns that are incorporated within 29 counties. And finally, a note on this is a lot of people have commented publicly. They've just complained. They go, well, we have all this money, more problems. Well, I've been on the other end of that where there's been no money, and y'all have too. And I'm telling you, having more money does not suck if we use it wisely. Are we together on this? Now, final word before I transition over to the high-flying, death-defying Erica Palmer-Smith is a final word on Medicaid expansion, just on the budget implications of this. So y'all have heard about Medicaid expansion. You're going to hear more about it. But here's the budget guy in me thinking about this. So now the federal government said all along is, look, we're going to pay, if you want to expand the Medicaid program mainly to working adults, because that's what it would do, we're going to pay for 90% of it. You have to pay for 10. All right, 10%. All right, fine, that's money, but okay. And then, but it's a lot higher than how much we generally pay for Medicaid. And basically, there's a lot of stuff where the state government is paying out of pocket for health care for a lot of these populations that aren't Medicaid eligible, but now the federal government pay 90% of it. So they probably save some money too. So the cost of that 10% is about 450, 500 million a year, call it. Okay, that's a lot of money. So what happens? Well, the federal government said, here's what we'll do. We'll give you an additional 5% match on the entire program. If you're one of the states that haven't expanded, like North Carolina, or want to do so, 5% on your entire program. Well, that's 850 million a year. So that's about 850 million a year for 2 years. So all of a sudden, wait a minute, it's costing me 500 million, but I'm getting 850, so I'm making out. And the reason why I think this is attractive to people is beyond all the explanations that you can give about Medicaid expansion, but from a budgetary point of view is one of the things, remember that the state, the Senate and the House have agreed that we're not going to spend more than a certain amount, even though we got a lot more money and we could spend it, we don't want to. We want to not exceed a certain level of general fund spend money a year. Well, the way this works, this bonus works, is it reduces general fund money because the federal government is paying for more of a Medicaid program you already have. So it reduces the general fund money. So it saves state taxpayers money. So for what it's worth, I think that's one of the reasons why they might do this. Gone through a lot in a hurry, but they gave me half an hour. I think I landed the plane within it, and I yield the balance of my time. So now, oh yeah, now I was supposed to introduce. So let me introduce you to sorry about this, the Executive Director, CEO, Supreme Commander, and all around a great leader, native North Carolinian, Erica Palmer-Smith, who has been with Care for Carolinas and is a coalition of a very diverse bunch of people, including some on this call. And I'm just going to turn it over here. She's going to pick up that Medicaid expansion and put it, actually deal with human beings rather than numbers. Erica, you're on.
Thank you, Dan. And can you do all of my future introductions? That was fantastic. Thank you. So I am going to take just a moment and share a slide show with you all. All right, so as Dan mentioned, Care for Carolina is a statewide coalition of now 111 member organizations that are focused solely on closing the health insurance coverage gap in North Carolina. Our coalition includes patient advocacy organizations, health providers, economic development organizations, and child and family advocates. And we are proud to include the North Carolina East Alliance of Chambers and the North Carolina Rural Center among our members. Dan has explained how the American Rescue Plan provides North Carolina with an unprecedented fiscal incentive to close the gap. And Patrick will talk about the importance of this to our local economies. But I'd like to just take a few minutes of your time to discuss exactly what the coverage gap is and what the characteristics of the population in that gap. So the coverage gap, in essence, is where someone falls when they make too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but not enough to get a subsidy in the private insurance marketplace. So for an adult without dependents, that's any income below 100% of the federal poverty line. For a parent, if they fall in the gap if they make more than 42% of the federal poverty line, but less than 100%. So you can see what those numbers, those percentages equate to in terms of real dollars for a family here between 1 and 4 individuals. So approximately a quarter of those in the gap are parents of dependent children. And so we can take an example of a single mom. Let's say that she has 1 child. So for her to qualify for Medicaid, she would need to make less than $7,240 over the course of a year. Now, if she's working and she's working 40 hours a week, 50 to 52 weeks a year, making minimum wage, then she will make nearly double that. So far and away more than what would allow her to qualify for Medicaid in North Carolina, but she would not earn enough money to get a subsidy in the private marketplace. Now, if we go back and look at those family sizes at the different income levels, you can see that were she to have 2 children, were she to have 3 children, she'd still make too much for Medicaid and fall into that coverage gap. So right now, there are 410,000 North Carolina children that have at least one uninsured parent. And by having the coverage gap that we have in our state, what we are doing for these parents is actually disincentivizing them from going to work. Because by not working, they actually are more apt to be able to get healthcare and some other things like that. So like our mom in that example, the majority of North Carolinians in the gap are working, 63%. And many of those are in frontline positions and in the industries that are struggling to find enough workers right now. Of those who are not working, 12% are not working due to caregiving. And so these can mean parents in a 2-parent household where one stays home with children because of the cost of childcare, or perhaps they're caring for elderly adults. 11% of those are not working due to illness or disability, which can include things like active cancer treatment. 7% of them are attending school, and then that leaves a remaining 7% that don't meet any of those criteria. So they're not working, they're not in school, they're not disabled, but that's just about 7% of that population. So looking a little deeper at the type of work these folks do, you can see again that these include, as I mentioned, many of the occupations that employers are struggling to fill right now. So our food service workers, our construction workers, childcare workers, nursing assistants. So these are the typical types of positions where employers aren't able to necessarily provide health insurance. Their income, their wages are such that they make too little to qualify for a subsidy in the marketplace. The other thing that I want to briefly mention is that 12,000 of these folks are actually veterans. In fact, in North Carolina, we have one of the highest rates of uninsured veterans in the nation, with 7% of our vets uninsured. Now, if we look a little bit more at where these folks are located, so this map is from the Georgetown University, and it looks only at workers, and it shows the percentage of workers in each county that are uninsured. And you can see here in the NC East territory, there are 3 counties where they have more than 20% uninsured workers. And so that's Greene County with 22.4% of their workers uninsured, Hyde County with 26% of your workers uninsured, and Terrell County, actually one of the highest percentages in the state with 26.6% workers uninsured. So for those workers who fall into this gap, for them to purchase a private plan without a subsidy, this would be the cost in each of those counties. So in Greene County, you can see this is for a 30-year-old woman who would fall into the gap. And so this is one of the lower rates. She would see monthly premiums in Greene County of $388, in Lenoir County of $400 a month. Those plans come with an annual deductible of $8,550, but we can see the estimated annual income being around just over $5,000 for each of these folks. If we go back to that same single mom's example previously, again, that 40 hours a week at minimum wage would put her making just under $14,000 a year. So her estimated annual expense would be about 1/3 of her income if she's in the gap. For a 40-year-old man in the gap, his rates would be around $450 a month for those monthly premiums. And then for a 55-year-old woman in the gap, her rates would be around $780 a month, depending on her county. So as I wrap up, I do want to take just a moment to mention the impact of this gap on health outcomes. So first, cancer. The American Cancer Society has found that the single greatest factor in determining whether or not someone will survive their cancer is whether or not they have health insurance. In fact, if an individual is insured at the time of cancer diagnosis, they have a 60% greater chance of survival than an individual who is not insured at the time of diagnosis. For heart disease patients, we know that preventative care, being able to have access to those blood pressure medications, makes such an impact on their overall mortality risk. And we know that in states that have closed the gap, we've seen lower heart disease mortality rates. For those folks who are able to survive their cardiac incidents, for stroke patients, we've seen greater neurological impairments among folks who were not insured and did not receive that preventative care earlier on. And we see longer hospital stays as a result of those incidents. We also know that states that closed their coverage gap saw lower maternal mortality than states that had not closed the coverage gap. And of course, this continues to be a major issue for us, especially in Eastern North Carolina. We also know that preconception coverage is so critical to ensuring good outcomes for infants and infant mortality rates. And unfortunately, for someone to qualify, of course, for Medicaid as a pregnant woman, they don't qualify until they know they're pregnant, and quite a bit of that health impact happens prior to them knowing that they have conceived. We also know that there is a tremendous impact on mental health and substance use by having that access to insurance. And states that have closed the gap have actually seen a 6% lower rate of total opioid overdose deaths. And with that, I would like to pass this over to Patrick Woody, who's the president of the North Carolina Rural Center, and eventually I'll learn how to stop sharing my screen. So Patrick is the president of the North Carolina Rural Center, and we are also pleased that he and the Rural Center have served as our fiscal agent over the last few years, a wonderful partner, and I think the best voice on building our local economies that we have. So thank you, Patrick.
Erica, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this morning. Let me get the presentation pulled up. And I want to talk to you really about three things this morning. But first, let me just acknowledge and say thank you. A big shout out to Van Rogerson and Trey for hosting this event. It's an honor to be on your stage in Eastern North Carolina, and we appreciate this opportunity very much. Dan, it's always great to hear your unique interpretation of the numbers, and you are a number speaker that can make sense of some pretty big and pretty complicated numbers. And Eric, I want to thank you for your explanation of what the coverage gap means and for really putting a human face on that for all of us. I want to touch on three things this morning and do so pretty quickly so we can talk with you all and hear what's on your mind. But first, I just want to touch on the advocacy work of the Rural Center, our priorities over the last several years, and the issues that we've been focused on that really are informed directly by our interactions with rural communities in 80 counties across the state. Secondly, I want to bring you up to speed and up to date about the Small Business Policy Task Force that the Rural Center convened in August of last year. They completed their work in February. Part of that work was some very important small business focus groups that were held in 5 regions across the state and what they told us. And then finally, to close out by talking about the economic impact of what closing the coverage gap via Medicaid expansion would really mean for rural North Carolina and for Eastern North Carolina in particular. So first, let me talk about the advocacy priorities of the Rural Center. As I said, this really is informed by our work with rural communities throughout the state. We focus our efforts on 80 rural counties. All 80 of those counties have population densities below 250 people per square mile. There's 80 counties. There's 432 municipalities located, or 420 municipalities located in those 80 rural counties. Consistently, what we've heard across almost every county has been real concern from an economic development standpoint about three big issues, but two additional issues that always are present as we have conversation with rural communities. Number one, expanding accessible, affordable, high-speed broadband. Number two, stabilizing and transforming rural health. Number three, investing in stronger entrepreneurial and small business development systems at a statewide level. Number four, advancing sustainable housing and particular concern around workforce housing. And then finally, revitalizing water and wastewater infrastructure. As Dan explained, because of the federal resources coming to the state, because of state revenues, I believe, are at a transformational moment, particularly for our rural communities. It's been a 15, 16 months of great challenge for everybody, all of us, and virtually everybody on the planet, but certainly for rural communities across rural North Carolina. But I also believe that we stand today at a moment of historic and one-time opportunity to really make a transformational dent in some of these big issues that we're facing. In terms of why the Rural Center really has drilled down and is focusing a lot of attention on small business development and has made that one of our top advocacy priorities, it's really because of the numbers. And so here it is by the numbers. In North Carolina, businesses with less than 50 employees account for 95% of business entities in the state of North Carolina. If you look just at the 80 rural counties, 75% of all business establishments in the 80 rural counties have fewer than 10 employees. So small business very much is the big business of rural. These very small firms of less than 50 account for 44% of all employment in North Carolina. Based on the most recent census data from 2017 to 2018, small businesses accounted for more than $1 trillion in annual sales. Researchers from the UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School have recently surveyed and have tracked from January 2020 through September of 2020 and estimate that North Carolina lost up to 19% of its small businesses. And between 2010 and 2020, there was a 27% decline in branch bank locations in rural counties compared to a 10% in branch location decline elsewhere. An important factor are the communities that are being left unbanked, which has severe economic ramifications for many rural communities. As we formed our small business policy task force and had an incredibly diverse and representative group of individuals, small business owners, major business associations and organizations that were represented on that small business policy task force, as they did their work across the state in multiple meetings between August and February of August of last year and February of this year. One of the things we did was go out and directly engage small business owners in focus group conversations in 5 regions across the state, representing 55 small business owners in 25 counties. And these were very in-depth conversations where we really drilled deep. We've produced a report. You see a copy there of it on the right-hand side of your slide. We'll make sure that a link to that report gets distributed to everybody on this call so you can take a look at it and really unpack it. But I'd like to highlight some of the key findings. And these key findings are divided into 4 key pillars that we think are really important to the small business development sector. And those include knowledge, support, opportunity, and funding. And I want to take just a minute to touch on some of the key findings in each of those areas. In terms of knowledge, certainly what we heard repeatedly was the great importance of resources such as the small business centers at the community colleges, the SBTDC offices in the public university system, but the need for more specialized offerings around e-commerce, social media marketing, search engine optimization, how to build back-end business processes were incredibly important to these entrepreneurs. The majority of entrepreneurs reported being vaguely familiar or somewhat uncomfortable with requirements and regulations around starting their specific business, and that they struggled with that regulatory aspect. They relied heavily on entrepreneurial networks to navigate a pretty complicated ecosystem. But I will say, for North Carolina's benefit, a very robust ecosystem of resources, just one that's pretty complicated to navigate. In the area of support under that pillar, health insurance was listed as a primary support needed both for the business owners themselves as well as for their employers. Workforce housing, access to high-speed broadband, again, always came up in these 5 regional focus groups as significant challenges and significant barriers to future economic growth. One thing we heard under the opportunity pillar is that state and federal business incentives are too tied to job numbers and too tied to big job numbers, and a need to really take a policy look at that and make some judgments about what really matters. And often repeated is the famous definition, and it's actually a little more complex than this, but SBA's definition of small businesses is having fewer than 500 employees. We repeatedly heard that none of us in rural North Carolina ever thought a 500 employee business was a small business. We heard that over and over again. In the area of funding, we heard over and over again about the importance of community banks versus a lot of the national banks, and the importance of Cdfis, community development financial institutions, and the increasingly important role they play in providing startup funding and expansion capital, and particularly loans at the smaller end of the scale, 250,000 and below, heavily reliant on community banks and Cdfis. We also heard that securing funding as a woman-owned or another hub business, historically underutilized businesses, was a real challenge and looked very different, and we needed to be aware of those differences. When it was all said and done in February, the task force came together. They adopted unanimously 20 policy recommendations that were included in North Carolina's new small business plan, A Pathway to Prosperity for All. And we'll make sure you have a link to this so that you can see how what we heard in those focus groups translated directly into a 20-point policy agenda that we've been working very hard on in the General Assembly. And I can report, as the Senate is debating and passing their budget finally through that we see many of those policy priorities from this document reflected in the Senate budget that's being debated right now. And many of the policy priorities around broadband, around water and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, in addition to small business policy, housing policy, also being included in that Senate document. But as I close and wrap up and move to really talk about the economic impact of health insurance coverage, I wanted to reflect this statement that was made by a Craven County restaurant owner that just, again, emphasizes what a critical decision point this is for the trajectory of a small business, and a small business owner even deciding whether or not to start a small business, whether or not to add employees, whether or not they can maintain and sustain their business, was often a question that revolved, at least one of the primary concerns was around how do I provide health insurance to myself and my family, but also to my employees, and having some pretty limited options. So we're accustomed to hearing all of the economic impacts of projects that are economic development projects that are locating in our state. Most recently, all the huge numbers associated with the location of Apple and the investment that we're going to make in North Carolina in the coming years. This is data that was done by George Washington University using an economic implant analysis to really determine what would be the economic and employment benefits of expanding Medicaid. And these numbers by partnership prosperity zone, if you will, these reflect the prosperity zone, so it doesn't necessarily reflect the NC East Alliance footprint. But what is the regional impact across the state? And you see there in the Northeast that in terms of the number of new jobs that would be created because of the expansion of Medicaid by 2022, 1,259 jobs would be created by that decision alone. If you look at it in terms of what does that translate into the gross county product by 2022, in that Northeast region of North Carolina, we would see an additional $233 million in gross county product as a result of Medicaid expansion. And then finally, what would be the county tax revenue that would be created by Medicaid expansion? And the estimate, according to George Washington University and the economic implant analysis, $3.2 million in additional county tax revenue by 2022. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. And I'm going to stop my screen share and look forward to a little bit of conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Dan and Erica, for some great information and great presentations today. So now we'll dive into some questions. So for the audience, again, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. And while we're waiting for some of those questions to roll in, I did receive a few prior to the webinar today. So one of the questions, I mean, we talk about broadband constantly. So what is the plan, or what are some of the plans that are improving broadband access for all? And anybody
Patrick, you're the king of all broadband, but also,
Well, I'll jump in, and I
Yes.
will say we've worked really hard over recent years to add some tools to the toolbox when it comes to broadband. And the most important of which at the state level was the creation of a state-based grants program for infrastructure. And it's called the GREAT program. It's operated by the Broadband Office within the Department of Information Technology at the state level. What I really want to emphasize from that I think is the most important takeaway is they've now done three funding rounds of allocating grants to last mile projects in really truly unserved and underserved rural parts of our state. And what we see is the demand for those funds, and the fact that the demand far exceeds the funding that we've put into it over the past several years. And so we've done a lot of really good work, but in the great scheme of addressing the overall challenge, we've a little bit been nibbling around the edges of what is a huge infrastructure gap and problem. As Dan walked through the numbers, and as we look at the state budget and the investment that is indicated in the Senate budget, we know a bill that passed the House a few weeks back. We know the governor's proposal for broadband that using the federal ARPA dollars. And what I see is a conversation happening at a level that is impactful, that really gets at solving this problem and closing this infrastructure gap. I also want to emphasize that in our policy work and in our work with legislators, we emphasize infrastructure is only one piece of it. And I think that is important to remember. And it may be the most important piece that we get out of this session, and we'll take it, and we'll take it at the level that we're having the conversation about. But we've also got to worry about the other two legs of the stool, which are affordability, people's ability to afford. There are some one-time resources on the ground right now available through participating internet service providers to their subscribers that qualify. That is really significant help in terms of affording broadband in the home. And then the final leg is just digital literacy. We still have a lot of work to do. My mom is 82 years old. She's in Allegheny County in Piney Creek. She has fiber to the home because of being served by a rural telephone membership cooperative. But she will not touch a computer. That is not her thing. It's not a lot of people's thing. And there is generational gaps, there are wealth gaps, there are gaps across other demographic factors that also have to be addressed going forward. But we should be proud of the work we've done in the last 3 years. We should be really excited and hopeful about the work that can be done in the next 2 or 3 years, between really now and the beginning of 2025, as a result of the unprecedented resources that we know are going to be put toward this issue.
If I can just jump on that, two more things. One is that the program would allow some more flexibility. The great grants heretofore have been limited to tier 1 counties, and now the 29 would have a right much share of that. Some counties, and some parts of other counties just aren't served. So I think getting the good maps to figure out where broadband is or isn't, or continual interest to policymakers. 2 is this idea of broadening the eligibility geographically. And 3, I think, is getting some kind of arrangement where the companies, the private companies, can use infrastructure already there to help get more access out there while paying a fair rate to the people who own that infrastructure. And I have friends on both sides of this, I'm with my friends. But those are the type of knotty issues, KNOTTY, that are being dealt with right now. And I think people understand is that there's some barriers along with the money, but dealing with policy that are being overcome. I know we've got more questions.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick and Dan. And I saw Sebastian mentioned in the chat the Starlink pilots that's occurring throughout North Carolina. I know Hyde County, Ocracoke is currently piloting the Starlink program. That is a good solution in some rural areas, but fiber to the home is the ultimate solution for everyone. So another question that we had was branding the region in terms of Eastern North Carolina. Are there any efforts to brand the region as a whole for Eastern North Carolina to attract marketing investment to the region?
There's money in the budgets for marketing, right? In both the governor's proposal and in the Senate proposal. I would say it's more targeted on the statewide effort. But clearly, if the Senate proposal becomes law, there's $60 million over the next 3 years towards marketing. Half of it dedicated towards tourism and travel to let people know we're here. And I think, anybody who's gone to North Carolina beach communities in the last year understands that that message has gotten out, that a lot of people have found safe refuge. But in some of the sounds and some of the other communities, perhaps some of that money is needed. I think the collaborative effort to work with EDP&C, I think a lot of you have seen and commented on the new commercial they put out, the new kind of ad featuring our Jackie Shelton Grainer, poet laureate. But there's nothing, the longer answer to your short question is no, there's not much focus, I think, on branding that region right now, at least not that we're aware of sitting here in Raleigh.
If I could just add on one thing, and that is from our perspective at the Rural Center, how important regional frameworks are. and certainly marketing, branding of regions incredibly important, but it is also important to solving these really huge issues at a local level. I believe we can only really do that if we apply regional frameworks, and we really get comfortable working in regional frameworks across county lines, across city and municipality lines in ways that are maybe new to us. But it really does afford us an opportunity to build greater capacity and build greater economies of scale to make efforts more sustainable going forward.
So I'm sorry, Van, just my message was there's money there to deal with this. The East just has to get in there and get their share, right? To be blunt about it.
Trey, if I can jump in just a second, we are looking at regional branding, and that is east of 95. And we can talk more about that later. I guess my question is, Dan, you said stay cool and let everything develop and fall out. I know there's entities like us that we have some very innovative initiatives that we are contemplating and planning to try to work in for the rural underserved. How and when is it time to become visible on trying to attract those? Do you see matches with these monies that are coming down, or is it, if you got a program that you can fully spend it in, is that going to be an opportunity? Are there any rules of the road that should guide us at all at this point?
Well, yes. So to answer your last question, so let me put on my golden leaf hat for a second and kind of, because it's instructive. One is this money is going to run out, right? I mean, there is a lot of it. And so you want to be used for it for something that you're going to have kind of a lasting benefit of it. And that's why I say, just give it a little bit of time. That said, to get kind of creative ideas together, Van, especially with a tie toward, here's how it answers the question of serving a community or a particular population or something that you can get a hook on with recovery from the pandemic, either in the health or the education or the business side, the better off you're going to be. The thing is that the people who are judged to be like the auditors and the protectors of this, they're all going to say you can't do anything, right? We're going to tie our shoelaces together. So you have to get together something, and with the rationale that I gave you about linking it back to those words that are in the federal guidance to say that's how we believe this to be allowable. But I certainly wouldn't wait around to create that is. I would just say you don't have to give it, you don't have to be in a rush to spend it right now. You want to get it right, not fast. But fast and right is always appreciated.
Thank you.
Awesome. We've got some questions coming in. Here's one from David Whitmer in regards to workforce development boards and the cut to funding recently to a lot of the workforce development boards. He mentioned Northeastern Workforce Development Board was cut 17%. I know Rivers East was cut close to 30%. And some of that was just, due to the formula and numbers wise, rural areas seem to have weathered the pandemic better than urban areas. So is there any funds available from the ARP funds to help workforce development boards?
Well, I think sure. Okay, so let me start. Could there be? Yes. All right. Now, are there? Not necessarily, because this is a problem that kind of recently emerged, right? But it is a revenue shortfall. So I think there could be rules, especially tied to recovery from the pandemic, for the general infrastructure of workforce development boards. Now, what the governor focused on is more specific programs, especially he kind of really tied his horse to the post-secondary, both the community colleges and the higher ed community in terms of credentials and helping people afford things to get your workforce more ready. And so there's a lot of concentration on that and concentration on training people for these kind of certain jobs. Of course, in the into East, you've been talking about your great advanced manufacturing, biopharma and everything else. And that's part of it, but they didn't get directly to this kind of core base issue, probably because they were dealing with things that, I tell you, when I was in the budgets, I like things that look cool too. I like the dessert rather than the meat and potatoes. But I think getting the word in on this is important. I think also there's another segment not related maybe to a lot of people on the call, but The fact is that the way the federal government supports domestic violence and sexual abuse, sexual assault shelters, the federal funding has really fallen off on that, and we're going to really feel a crisis on that. So as an uncharacteristic display of conscience, I will just tell you that those are types of things to keep an eye on too. For those of you who may serve on those boards, that is a real challenge. We have the wallet. The question is, do we have the will? Usually the question's the other way.
Thank you, Dan. Another question for you, Dan, is what does business assistance under the state fiscal recovery plan encompass?
Okay, so for the Senate, it's two things. One is $1 billion to basically give up to 18,000 some odd dollars, basically to offset the taxes you would have paid on the expenses you can no longer deduct from the Paycheck Protection Program or the Economic Injury Disaster Idle Loan Program from SBA or something like that. And it's a specific formula. And the idea here is that revenue will look at its list of people who've gotten that and send you a check. Well, okay. So that's $1 billion of it. $500 million of what they propose is for, the Senate proposes is for kind of businesses, small businesses that have not gotten any other help from any other source, but have lost more than 20% of its revenue. I don't know how many takers there are going to be. That I don't know who fits in that category, to be blunt about it. But I think they wanted to make sure they covered people who hadn't gotten any help at all. And God love them. And maybe some people just didn't think they needed the help and find out, oh, wow, I really do. And then on the governor's side, I mean, the main program there is a restaurant and lodging assistance program, because that industry got, depending on where you look in the state, but I'll tell you overall in the state just got crushed. I mean, clubbed like a baby seal. And the idea here is they lost several billions of dollars really in revenue over the year. And the idea is to help them recoup some of that. So that was a proposal put forward by the Restaurant and Lodging Association. It was basically look at your tax records, how much revenue you've collected, and give you a percent of that back. Not of the taxes you've collected, but they kind of know how much in sales you've done. So that was the governor's main initiative there. There are also initiatives that both agree on Retool NC, this idea of helping small businesses, especially minority-owned businesses, and other things. But coming off of Patrick's great leadership on the Rapid Recovery Loan Program, which has now kind of come to an end, the Small Business Credit Initiative is yet to come, and I think we're waiting for guidance on that.
Thank you. Robbie Davis, I see you raised your hand. Just confirm with me that you want to ask a question. And while we're waiting on that, another question from Deborah Watts. Has anyone looked at the cross benefits and bottom line contribution to local budgets from the contribution telehealth can make in addressing multiple needs for uninsured mental health services delivered to schools, aging in place, and monitoring for seniors?
That's a
great question, therefore not answered. But I think there's a greater appreciation for telehealth and it's important in the community. And I think kind of what these changes you're seeing in the region between the largest hospital system and its largest university, some opportunities for expansion of that, really. Telepsychiatry from ECU, which has been Dr. Saeed, which is some of the most pathbreaking in the country, has really been taken to a new level. And that was developed out before COVID and will be, with the mental health issues that unfortunately so many of us are dealing with, a real thing. But no, ma'am, there has not been that kind of analysis. But let me just talk to you as a budget guy and just say this briefly, is like, sometimes we should just do things, not for the economic benefit of them, but just because it's the right thing to do, and this improve health outcomes and help people get access to health in remote areas and a lot of people who can't travel. So that's reason enough, but I hear your point. That's why it's been explored as much.
Thank you. And Beth Buckside, I see you raised your hand, so I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question. You should be good to go.
All right.
There you go.
And first, thank you for doing this. This is really helpful information. And Dan, and Patrick, good to see your face again. Same with you and Van and Trey. I have two questions, basically. Of course, beginning of March 2020, a lot of businesses started up around that time, actually before that time. those businesses that I've been assisting don't qualify because they can't prove that they lost 20% of their revenues, yet they invested money, created jobs, and were struggling. And so my question is, do you see any help coming from them? Because quite frankly, the businesses that are struggling can't handle another loan. I've been looking at the loan stuff,
Right.
and they can't handle it. And then on the same note, those that have tried to apply, like for the PPP and stuff like that, we talked about the lack of banks within and lending institutions in rural areas, found that even when they went to the lenders that were on the list, that those folks had no capacity to take on their loan application. So we've actually had a lot of folks in rural eastern North Carolina unable to get through that process, and then others in need who couldn't receive it. And then the second part of it was we discussed the rent utilities program, which was a very helpful program, but it left out people who might have been laid off because of the pandemic, but still had a mortgage, and those needs are just as real. Do you see anything in the legislature or ARP that could help people that are trying to help themselves?
Well, leave it to Pamlico County to ask the kind of get to the heart of it, right? But let me handle the third question. Maybe Patrick, I don't know, you might have better ideas than I do on this first two. Is Beth on the homeowner assistance on the mortgage, the Housing Finance Agency, which is a very competent, well-run agency, one of the best in government, frankly, is administering about $275 million in homeowner assistance monies. If you go to nchfa.org, you can see their plan to deal with it. And I think the Senate would require them to do some more, frankly, I think unnecessary public comment period, because I think with the public comments, we need money. But I would say that is out there. And so that money is coming for kind of owners versus renters. So I'll just stop there. And I know on the only other thing I'd say is on these businesses that haven't gotten any help, maybe I was wrong. The Senate has a program especially for that. And we'd love to work with you, if that becomes law, and there's a lot of doubt about anything right now, we'd be happy to work with you on that. Patrick, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
The only thing I'll add is just, I talked about the loss of branch bank locations. I also talked about the increasing importance of community banks and Cdfis. There is a line item in the Senate budget that directly addresses building the capacity of the community development financial institutions across North Carolina that are doing small business lending. Cdfis have become increasingly important in the national landscape of lending, particularly to businesses in lower dollar amounts at the lower end of the scale, particularly startups or businesses that don't have a lot of credit history or experience. And that is an industry that is not as strong in North Carolina as it needs to be. That's one of the reasons the Rural Center launched Thread Capital, which is a certified Cdfi. We're one of 9 that we think of across the state. There's more business there than these 9 can possibly do. And it's really important that we invest in and build the Cdfi industry. It exists for a reason. And a lot of it has to do with the regulatory environment following the Great Recession and kind of how that incentivizes banks, the types of lending banks can do, the types of lending banks can't do, but also an incentive for banks to invest in the lending activities of Cdfis. But kudos to the state Senate for recognizing that this industry's capacity needs to be built. And for including for the first time ever money in a budget that would do exactly that.
Yeah, but Beth, let me answer your first question, which we didn't answer, is on the idea of a newly created business, right? I think the reason why those ideas showing loss is because the federal government is going to show an economic impact from the coronavirus pandemic. And the easiest way to show that is like, okay, my revenue was here, now it's here. So I've had hurt, I've had harm. And so that gives them the paperwork to demonstrate the harm. Now that said, could you make this case for newly created, and I've been, like you, I've heard from some of those too. I think there could be, but that's why it is why it is. But I would suggest you get in front of, these businesses may want to talk to their House, frankly, North Carolina House members about that, because the federal government has now gone on from this, right? The federal government's like on the infrastructure and everything else. So the House is your chance right now.
And do you mind if I ask Van and Patrick a question?
Correct.
Kevin Roberts approached me several months ago. He's the New Bern Chamber of Commerce director, great guy, and said that at a meeting there for Pitt County Chamber of Commerce, that a question had come up of creating a combined statistical area, Eastern North Carolina, about, I think it was like 9 or 10 counties. Is there a way that we could work together with you to try and figure out how to navigate that forward? Because I think with some of the stuff that Dan and Patrick have been talking about, that could be very, very useful. And talking about working as a region and all that. And Van, I know you're on board with it. And then on the same note, one of the problems that we face often as a small county is you have to swim in a big shark tank with a lot of sharks. Try to be nice and act like a fish, but not get eaten by the sharks. And so a lot of times those pools of money come into a region, and we find that pretty well we get shut out because the bigger sharks are gobbling it up. So, I know we can't guard against that all the time, but if there were a way we could try and move forward with some stuff without that being so consistent, I think that more of the smaller counties would be able to engage.
Yeah, Beth, as far as our group goes, let's have a discussion in the next week or two about the statistical area. There are several ways to bring recognition to your region. That could be one, the branding of Eastern 95. We even are having some preliminary discussions with I-87 being 4-lane from Raleigh to Rocky Mount to Elizabeth City to Norfolk, and that broadband going down that is at the bottom leg that we now can talk again about a super region, which has been talked years ago with Richmond, Raleigh, and Hampton Roads, and there's a southern corridor for that. So I think there's all kinds of new opportunities that are developing because of these things, and I look forward to chatting with you again. Trey has set something up so us three can talk with you. Okay.
Thank you. I'm in the middle of some computer issues and I've lost my email contact. So Trey, if you would connect us, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Will do, Beth. Thank you. All right. John Chafee asked, has anyone or organization placed a number on the savings that the state or healthcare providers would achieve by reducing the number of people receiving indigent care?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'll defer to Dan and Erica.
I mean, Erica, wake up here. I mean, Erica may know better than I, but I know in other states that there's been some work on it. Erica, do you have an answer on that?
Well, yes. So the first answer is that no, there is not sort of a statewide number on exactly what we've lost in terms of uncompensated care. What I can say is we have a lot of data from other states on how Medicaid expansion has affected their hospital closure rates. And so I'll mention a couple of those. In the last 5 years, 82% of the rural hospital closures have happened in non-expansion states like North Carolina. We've seen 6 of our hospitals closed since 2010. But we also know that states that have already closed their gap, they actually see a 62% decrease in the likelihood of those hospital closures. So unfortunately, I can't give a finite answer to what those numbers look like, but we do know that there's a very strong correlation.
Right, and it's just to hop on that. The thing is, the net number to North Carolina is not going to be that 450 or $500 million. It will be a number less than that, and especially in Ohio, the evidence is there that saved a lot. But that said, it's very hard just because of the way budgeting and testing works about how also to why is there this reduction in demand on the general fund side. But what you could say is there'll be some savings, John. But not get into that because you don't want to tie yourself to that, and then it doesn't materialize and the critics come and fuss at you. You want to be prepared for the kind of the outer bound, and the savings will come for sure.
Awesome. And I see Charlotte Griffin mentioned in reference to small business assistance that the COGS offer, well, Mideast Commission offers a 5-year interest-free loan for $50,000. So that was a great point, Charlotte. Thank you. I believe that is all the questions that we have received. So Van, do you want to wrap us up a little early?
Well, I mean, now we're having the mayor of Beargrass, letting the guy from Beargrass close us out. I see how this goes. I see how this home cooking is.
By the way, if you haven't gone to Beargrass and eaten at Deadwood, see the mayor. We'll hook you up. Just want to thank everybody for joining us today. This has been very informative. I think this is a topic we'll talk about quite a bit more in the future. I hope you have a great weekend. Have a good 4th of July. We'd love to have you as a regional advocacy partner with us. So give us a call. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Patrick, Dan, Erica, appreciate it.
Thank you.